years of our work together. And by way of reminder, today's session is being recorded. My name is Alan Ingram. I serve as a Wallace consultant for the ELLC community as a discussion driver with Ohio and Missouri, and will serve as your moderator for today. Next slide, please. So we are joined today by members of the 11 ELLC teams representing 11 states from across the country, including participants from Florida. And so our thoughts and prayers are definitely with those Floridians, all Floridians, and we hope that they are safe and well from the storm. Next slide. Just want to review today's agenda. And just a reminder that our time together today is from 1 o'clock to about 2:30 Eastern time. The first half of today's session, our virtual convening today, will be the plenary session where we will hear from the ELLC Steering Committee representing the Council of Great City Schools and Ray Hart, Carissa Moffett-Miller, Chief Executive Officer for CCSSO, and Hal Smith, the Senior Vice President from the Urban League, along with a report from Brenda Turnbull, a principal at Policy Studies Associates. We'll hear from her on the PSA report. Just by way of reminder, following hearing from our steering committee and Brenda on the report, we'll have a Q&A session where you will be encouraged to submit your questions via the chat box, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But following the plenary session, you'll be automatically taken to the breakout sessions facilitated state team time. Next slide. So just a reminder about our meeting norms for today, and want to encourage everyone to keep their cameras on. If you by chance have to leave for a personal matter, we recognize that and encourage you to turn it off at that time. But if you would, while you're in the meeting and engaging with us today, please keep your cameras on. We'd also ask that you find a quiet area and try to limit the background noise. Mute yourselves when you are not speaking. And then again, a reminder to please submit any questions that you have from the Q&A session via the chat box for today's virtual convening. This will allow us to maximize the use of our time together today, and thanking you all in advance. Next slide. So we will now begin the plenary portion of today's virtual convening, and want to begin by introducing or reintroducing our steering committee members, starting with Ray Hart, the Executive Director for the Council of Great City Schools, Carissa Moffett-Miller, the CEO of the Council of Chief State School Officers, and Hal. I haven't seen any damage from the house. This is the first time I've been up here. Someone, background noise, would ask you to please mute. And then again, reintroducing Hal Smith, the Senior Vice President for Education, Youth Development, and Health at the Urban League National Office. So again, welcome to our steering committee, folks, and so glad that all of you could be with us today. And just again, part of our purpose is reflecting on the lessons that we've learned over the last 6 years. Would just like to ask you each to start with, you know, again, as you reflect on the work over the last 6 years, what are some of the big ideas, the big takeaways, or the lessons learned from where you sit and what you've seen? And Carissa, I'd like to start with you, if you don't mind. Welcome, and so glad to hear from you.
Thanks, Alan. And thanks to all of you for being here. And also, since we're wrapping this up, thank you for all the work that you have put in over this time. We just have a few minutes, and so I'm going to take it at a 50,000 foot level, and Brenda will get into, you know, some of the successes that I think we'll discuss later. The first thing is to thank the Wallace Foundation for the long-term investment. And I think that's the important piece here, is that in order to see outcomes and impact, we have to be able to invest in long-term work together, particularly the relationships that were built, the trust that was needed to be able to move things forward. That kind of investment in the time to do that was really a key piece of what I've seen, now being involved in this project over the 6 years that it's changed. And none of this work was easy. That's the big takeaway for me. The second piece is that this project evolved over time. We were, as we were talking about it, I was remembering some of the times when it wasn't so easy to get to agreement on certain things. I mean, some of you may be nodding and saying, yes, we know what that feels like. And it evolved from, ESSA passing, principal leadership, moving to putting equity front and center, even when that was difficult and hard. And evolving relationships to get us to the place that we needed to go. And so I think the big takeaway for me was that the ability to talk through differences, but more importantly, the time and space to listen and understand each other. And some of that shows up in the report as well, but how important that is. And that goes to my third point, which is the sustainability of these kinds of structures and importance of the connections among all of the groups that are here. Like when we think about COVID hitting, the pandemic, these relationships were relied upon to think about what you did with the grant that Wallace gave you to help bolster this and move it forward. We adapted and changed, and the set of funding that's come forward, like part of this was planned so that you could use that funding to bolster some of the work that you had done already. So there's lots to look forward to. There's lots still to be done, but I also just want to add a special thank you to my colleagues, Ray and Hal, who have become invaluable to me as we've gone through the past 6 years. So thank you.
Thanks, Carissa. Appreciate it very much. Ray, I'd like to go to you next, representing the Council of Great City Schools. Your reflections on the work over the last 6 years, and to recognizing that you came to the project as executive director after Mike had left. So just want to acknowledge that as well as Carissa.
Thank you. And want to first of all start by thanking Carissa for those kind words, but thanking again the Wallace Foundation as well for really the vision to pull this group together in such a special way. And I'll talk a little more about what is meant for our districts, but the partnership in general. But also want to thank both the National Urban League as well as the Council of Chief State School Officers for the partnership and working together. And you mentioned, or Carissa mentioned, that the project evolved. And at the outset, there was discussion about what was different about ESSA relative to prior reauthorizations of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And so some of those differences we really focused on really lifting up. Some of them really put a lot of the onus on states rather than the kind of the federal guidelines that had traditionally been in place, really putting the onus on states for establishing kind of accountability measures, how they were going to measure accountability a little differently in their accountability systems. Also in terms of looking at students who were English language learners in our states, across our states. And there were other state set-asides that were important elements of ESSA that really this group helped to begin to define how are we going to utilize those, how are we going to talk about making those meaningful and making sure that our students and our schools and our school systems really benefit from the work that's done both at the state level and the local level. So the fact that a number of those were new in ESSA really meant from the Wallace's Foundation's vision really meant that this collaboration was important and critical. And so I just want to thank them for their work over the years. There were a number of things that I think, again, at a high level that made this work beneficial. As Carissa mentioned earlier, it evolved. So even though those were some of the things that in early on we talked about doing, that evolution really meant a different way of working and interacting. And for our districts, it was helpful to have the ongoing communications and ongoing opportunities to work with, partner with, hear from those not only in their states, but those in other states as well. So the convenings that were held in New York that allowed our state teams, our district teams, and our National Urban League affiliates to come together in New York and really have conversations about what was going on across the country, I think was really beneficial. In a number of our districts, there are also some tangible things that are really going to live beyond the ELLC. In Northeast Ohio, for example, one of the things that they created as a function of this work was the Northeast Ohio ELLC, where they got together with a number of different school districts and community partners in Northeast Ohio to create their own kind of subgroup of this larger group. That subgroup created toolkits to support parents and their engagement with schools as a function of ESSA. In Nebraska, for example, the leadership developed work to assist schools in identifying their comprehensive school support and improvement efforts. So there was really a group in Nebraska that did that. In Wisconsin as well, they actually created a coalition that hadn't existed before, comprising the state's big 5 school districts, which really was an outgrowth of the work that was done between Milwaukee and the state of Wisconsin as a part of the work. All of those are still ongoing to this day, and all of them have helped to continue to foster relationships between the local school districts in the states and their state departments of education. So I think all of those are things that have been beneficial. Brenda, as was shared earlier, will share additional details as we go on about the benefits of the program, benefits of the project, or what it's meant, how it's worked. But I think just the foresight to pull the group together to begin to think about, how do we do this differently? How do we do this work differently, particularly given the fact that ESSA was so unique in its language and so unique in how we needed to work together to really build relationships, I think was invaluable. So again, thank you to the Wallace Foundation. Thank you to the partners. And then lastly, I want to thank all others, Alan, yourself, and others who also work to support the interactions across the states and districts over the last 6 years. I think what you've put together what you've done has been invaluable as well. So thank you for that coordination.
Great. Thanks, Ray. Appreciate it very much. And Hal, I want to go to you next. Again, thinking about your reflections and what a great opportunity to bring the Urban League as a partner to this work and endeavor, and certainly welcome the chance to hear from you and your reflections.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Alan. And thanks, of course, to my colleagues at CCSSO and the council, the Wallace Foundation. I want to second and third everything that Ray and Carissa have already said, but it was an important investment and has been an important investment for the Urban League movement. You know, to be honest, when we began this, we weren't quite sure of the role of the Urban League affiliates in this work. We made a very strategic decision, I think in our second meeting, that the districts and the Urban League did not necessarily need to come from the same city. And I think that allowed us some great flexibility to bring expertise, but also to bring vision on how to connect community to these more formal conversations around policy led by the districts, led by the state departments and chiefs, but certainly well-informed by the Urban League affiliates and the other community stakeholders. And we wanted to make sure that that kind of involvement and engagement was there from the very beginning. Quite often, communities are brought in when things are half-baked or more fully baked, just a rubber stamp. That was not this. And that was the intention at the very, very beginning, that we were going to be bringing on some partners in the Urban League affiliates and other community stakeholders who perhaps needed to be onboarded into the policy discussion, but certainly not the focus on children and their success or on equity. So while not being equity experts, it was certainly something we thought we could bring to bear, working definitions that we had, connections and coalitions of which we were a part. Those were really important to bring to bear in the project as well. But I think it's really three things I'll take away from the ELLC on top of all the invaluable relationships and conversations we've had as we've dug deep in these states around the work, is really the evidencing of trust and relationships over time. This is, in addition to the generous funding of the foundation, this is what's made it sustainable. There were a number of bumps in the early days and probably all along, but certainly as we got to know one another, that could easily have taken this thing down, easily could have made people say, oh, this is the same old thing, we're not being heard, this is not genuine, this is not authentic. But I think the process that we use to bring folks together, including the PLCs, help bring trust and relationships in ways that people were not used to. That those relationships became more robust, more durable, because of the time we spent together working on issues, as Carissa said, that evolved, opportunities that evolved, challenges that evolved. But trust and relationships, I think, were central. The second is clarity. I think of our earliest PLC, when we were sharing equity definitions, and the idea that some folks would, in process, while they were hearing these definitions shared, say, you know what, we're not clear in our definition. And I'm going to own that in our presentation here. And we're going to go back to work on our team because we're just not clear enough. I see the examples that other people are raising. I see their definitions. I see the questions coming from the state teams, and we're just not there. And I think that clarity of purpose, of vision, was really important and remains so because every evolution of the definitions meant the work got sharper, the questions got better. Third, I'll say, the ownership and the flexibility. There were moments and many moments when our affiliate CEOs, many of whom are on this call, said, I knew this was different the day we started talking about equity and people weren't waiting for me to speak. Everybody else owned it and talked about it from their own perspective about what this meant and how they came to understand equity in a different way, or in the shared way is probably more appropriate. But the flexibility to take those relationships and move them on to, yes, dealing with COVID, dealing with changes in leadership, that kind of ownership meant flexibility was possible. In school development, I would certainly point to the Tennessee Playbook and say that the ways in which folks understood the tangible benefit of that kind of clarity, that kind of collective ownership, meant that other people had permission to do things that made sense in their context without mimicking it. As important as it was as an anchor, they saw what was possible. The tools that Carissa and Ray mentioned, also examples of that. But the idea that ownership meant that people were going to take care of this relationship, of this team, so that it could be used to impact things outside of the original scope, is something I'll also take away.
Yeah, thanks, Hal, so much for your comments. And I'd like to thank all of our steering committee representatives for your leadership, the partnership that you represent, and been such a joy to work with all of you. Next up, we want to turn to Brenda Turnbull to reintroduce, if you will, the ELLC report from PSA. And this was sent in advance as a pre-reading for those of you who may not be aware. It's also available on the Wallace website. And the report is titled All the Voices, Statewide Collaborations for School Leadership under ESSA. Brenda, I turn to you.
Thanks very much, Alan. All of us at PSA are very excited to be part of this gathering. Since day one of the ELLC, we've been in the room, we've been working alongside every team, and our aim has been to capture and publicly share what the ELLC has built for the field. Next slide. What's unique here? What should the field know? I won't repeat what my colleagues from the steering committee have eloquently expressed: collaboration, relationships and partnerships, and innovations for equity-centered school leadership. Next slide. Our title for our report is All the Voices. It comes from a team member who is an Urban League staff member who spoke about the power of building trust and facing hard questions as a team in these words that you see here. Truly thought-provoking conversations and questions. Next slide. What I'll do next is too briefly, highlight accomplishments of each team. Unimaginatively, I will go in alphabetical order. We will start with Florida, a state that is, as Alan said, we're all thinking of. This team showed resilience as ELLC members. They started their work in earnest just as COVID arrived. Nevertheless, they built a learning network of principals from 14 districts throughout the state, learning together about and helping the state learn about literacy, instructional improvement, data, culture of caring in schools. The team has gone on to work with the state on questions about the best way of monitoring programs for leader preparation statewide. Next, we'll turn to Maryland. Next slide. This is a team that Hal spoke of clarity of vision. I think in this team's work with the state on specifics of ESSA plan language and ESSA implementation choices brought clarity. Include principal leadership as an instrument for improvement in schools, include equity in the accountability system, communicate effectively about accountability systems, and then most recently, overseeing development of resources on leading for equity. Next slide. Moving to Minnesota, which has had a bold vision for local leadership, captured in the Minnesota Equity in Action Framework. It's a vision where the community works together with school leaders for student success. And the team has put together this framework with specific guidance for local school and community leaders, and has also worked to develop other resources, other learning opportunities to support this kind of authentic partnership toward leadership. Next slide is Missouri, where a team that pulls together the state, districts, university, community leaders around innovations centered on leadership and equity. We can see in the first couple of bullets here the improvements in state work, in the major program of principal leadership development, and in the school accountability system. For the participating districts, strengthening principal supervision, for principal preparation programs, a new module on equity, and training and resources for school boards. I will note that the State Association of Local School Boards has been a member of the team all along. And there's a two-way conversation between the team and its members. Next slide shows Nebraska, which has brought a range of innovations, equity commitments from the state agency, the rollout of the state's first set of standards for school leaders. 3 smaller districts that collaborate in principal preparation, the Tri-City Ascend Academy. All along, regional service agencies and university have been active contributing members along with the others. And to this day, the team is working to deepen its understandings about leadership for equity, working with its established logic model that it started very early and continues to touch upon and use as a guiding inspiration, really. Next slide, please. New York has focused on the principles that urban schools and urban districts need. both in advising the state on what's called a P20 program of principal preparation, where universities and school districts partner, and most recently in looking at the early results from the initial sites of that program, which is partially supported as part of the state's Title II work. The team has also overseen the development of a really nice suite of curriculum materials for principal preparation centered on equity, aligned with the Professional Standards for Educational Leaders, or PSELs. Next slide. We'll look next at Ohio, which, as was mentioned, has built a network that leads with strength. This team reframed school improvement as a strengths-based process and brought together districts along with their community partners in a community of practice to do that work together. The state agency has been not only a resource, but a listener, learning and gathering useful ideas for state policy implementation. And most recently, they produced a toolkit for parents. Next slide. The Oregon team is currently working on leader induction with an up and running academy at the Portland Public Schools that may have potential for statewide use. This is based on principal leadership competencies that some time back, the ELLC team had a major role in developing. The team lives on, now called the Statewide Leadership Advisory Committee, and works at a high level with the state to this day. Next slide. The Pennsylvania team has been a champion for diversifying school leadership. It is currently working, all members, community-based, higher ed, state education agency, are currently working, organizing national and regional conferences, organizing local focus groups. These activities raise awareness of the issues. They identify specifically what the challenges are, and they're a forum for the needed work on solutions. Next slide. The Tennessee Leaders for Equity Playbook is very much a collaborative product of every member of the team, writing, revision, editing over the years. This resource and its principles for a range of leaders in every community have been shared in conferences, in Urban League meetings, in principal programs. They live on in digital modules, which are available on a website and on YouTube. And the foundational partners for the work continue to collaborate together in Tennessee. Next slide. The Wisconsin team, as has been mentioned, created the Wisconsin Urban Leadership Institute with design work that was a shared endeavor by every team member. This institute fills gaps that were seen in principal professional learning opportunities having to do with a focus, tailoring to urban assets and challenges, equity-centered, culturally responsive leadership. It is sustained with state funding on the Title IIA set aside, and it is in its 5th year of operation. Next slide, let me begin to summarize what the states have done, what these teams, I should say, have done. There are ideas, innovations of all of these kinds that other communities, school districts, and states can see and learn from. Next slide. I think I mentioned the Title II resources illustrated by a Wallace publication about tapping federal resources for this kind of work. Several teams did have work that aligned with the state's use of it set aside under Title IIA, thanks to the ESSA amendment, which included school leadership as part of that work. Next slide. As has been said, none of this was easy. What was hard was at least 3 things, 3 buckets that I want to highlight. Engaging all the voices, building trust. From our observation, some of the ways that happened, one was the egalitarian nature of these teams. Nobody was designated as the team leader who was going to call the shots. The members, the facilitators, work together to encourage and urge participation from everyone. And over time, time's a huge ingredient here, over time, trust developed. Second, we all know agency leadership turns over. This problem was mitigated by the fact that team members always welcomed and supported the new agency leaders as they became ex officio members. And I would add too that the Urban League affiliate leadership tended to have greater stability and was typically part of the nucleus that was there to welcome new leaders of the education agencies. Finally, as has been said, it is not easy to commit deeply to equity and racial justice and to speak out loud about that in a group that's full of people you may not know. These teams have done that, and they are currently doing it in our polarized climate. They took on those difficult discussions early, as has been mentioned, and that inspired them and has, we believe, helped them persist in spite of the challenges. Next slide. A few final points that I'd like to make about the power of collaboration as we've seen it. And a bunch of this has been said too. Al mentioned everyone brings their connections and their coalitions. That's right. It's one of those, the answer is in the room things. A team of leaders who have different perspectives, different strengths, has the knowledge to solve problems in education. State agencies, school districts, and communities can and do learn from one another, even though they may have fraught histories with some tension. I would highlight again that community organizations have a stake and have a compelling voice in supporting and strengthening school leadership. Overall, trust and a sense of purpose grew out of honoring every voice and, in fact, struggling together as a team. I would say that struggle is one of those elements that differentiates this from kind of token conversation, as folks have mentioned. Finally, equity has been a North Star. On the next slide, I just want to express on behalf of all of us at PSA our huge appreciation for the privilege of learning with you and from you. And I want to say thank you, and then leave you with a slide that is a glimpse of some of the many resources available from for free on the Wallace Foundation website. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Brenda. Really appreciate
Alan, you're muted.
again, thanking Brenda for the rich summary of the report and the cross-sector collaboration of the lessons learned. So appreciative of that. We now want to move to the Q&A portion of today's plenary, and it's an opportunity for us to dig in and ask questions of not only Brenda, but our stakeholders as well. And so please use the chat for that. We've dedicated about 15 minutes. If we need to go longer, we will, and adjust appropriately. So as you get started and using the chat box, one question that I would like to pose to our steering committee, thinking about building trust, which we heard talked about a lot, but just wondering, what advice might you have for the 11 ELLC teams about sustainability beyond Wallace support, right? So you've seen this from your perch. What advice might you offer about sustainability?
Sure, so I'll start. And this is something that we've talked about a great deal with the Urban League, not just for this project, but in general, that the work, the exhibited work of a coalition is foundational to getting sustainability in place in terms of funding, right? The relationships are there, but people want to know what you've done and what else you might be able to tackle because of those relationships, because of the foundational work of working through a series of problems and challenges and identifying opportunities because you have a way of working. The way of working is essentially what you'd be arguing for additional support for in your community. It would be evidence of the coalition, of the work, of the relationships, of the focus and flexibility. But I think taking a way of working and applying it to other challenges and opportunities would be the key to sustainability, because you would not be able to replicate the conditions of 6 years ago. We're in a very different world, but a way of working can carry you through any kinds of changes and shifts. And that would be the thing I'd point to.
Gotcha. I know we've got some folks that got to jump off. Ray, looked like you were about to comment.
I did. I would like to comment. I think one of the things that's important as well is maintaining communication. I think that your ability, you've fostered an opportunity and a way of communicating. I think the leadership is going to change. And I think that you mentioned earlier in the conversation that I am new to my role. I wasn't in this role in 2016 when this process started, but the collaboration that was already established with the National Urban League and with the chief state school officers, the relationships with both Carissa and Hal. I had the opportunity to go to New York a couple of weeks ago to work with Hal on one of their projects. I've done the same with Carissa. And so the communication that was established as part of this process has enabled me as a new leader to transition into the role, but continue the work. And I think the same applies for those who are in the local affiliates, our local school districts, as well as the states. The leadership is going to change. That's inevitable. The leaders in our organizations are going to change, but maintaining the communication as a function of this work, I think, will be critical. And I just want to thank the Wallace Foundation for the opportunity to share here. Thank you for helping to build those bridges between our organizations and also helping to foster and support the work on the ground across the country. I think it's been invaluable, but maintaining the communication as we move forward, I think is critical. And so even though I've got to jump off for another meeting, I appreciate the opportunity to share.
So go ahead, Carissa.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in. Thanks, Ray. But very fundamentally, Brenda referenced the report on the blending and braiding of federal funds. That's work that we've done a tremendous amount of work on and have partnered with Wallace on that. I think that's the ground level stuff where we get out of these silos where particularly federal funding can only be spent on a specific thing. And there is so much flexibility around that this will allow for sustaining once we get past this huge infusion of money that's come to districts and we start to think about the long-term thing. So that's just like ground level stuff that I would say, take a look at that. The second piece is we take an approach in this organization about what we're for. And I think when you come together as a group, and there was reference in the report about like getting to a theory of action, getting to the what are we going to work on together was hard. And it was something that took time. And I think when you come together and you talk about what you're for, not come in to like what hasn't happened, what isn't happening, what we're against. I think when you start to come together for what you're for, it gets a lot easier to continue that work. And then you can start to build things around that. And I'll just add an ancillary funny thing about relationships. Like everything comes around, right? Like never burn your bridges with your friends or anyone that you've worked with, because on this very webinar is my high school advanced math teacher who joined, and I was like, what is he doing on here? And I know exactly what state he's in and what he's working on, but every relationship will come back to you and you should treat it that way. And I think that's probably what I'd offer.
Great. Thanks, Carissa. Here's a question in the chat box from Paul Kadnick with the Missouri team. What suggestions do you have for these different partner groups to continue to work together without the ELLC structure? So I don't know if that's a question for the Wallace team or either one of our representatives from the steering committee or Brenda. Any thoughts, comments, or suggestions to Paul's question?
Yeah, so I think it's similar to what I answered in the beginning. The structure doesn't have to go away. simply because the funding ends. Like the structure is the structure, the team is the team.
Yeah.
And finding other ways to focus the attention of that team on the problems that you're facing today, or the opportunities. I don't want to just focus on problems, but the kinds of things that make sense to move forward. And the things that you abandon, you strategically abandon, right? There may be elements of the ELLC that don't transfer easily to a new setting, but the relationships will, the way of working will, the invitation to others who might add something to the work can remain. But I don't know how you easily replicate something like this, the PLC, right? That I don't know how you get that, but there are probably ways to have local and statewide conversations that can attempt to bring in other voices, but being intentional, perhaps not a neighboring state. I know that that's not always the easiest way to get new ideas in, but people from across the country who are similarly dealing with something or attempting something, always staying open to new ideas and better questions, I think is an additional feature.
Great. Thanks, Ray, or Hal, excuse me.
Sure.
Looks like another question in the chat. An idea for a question for Brenda. How different is this inclusive approach from standard practice for the state policy setting, right? So you talked about the uniqueness of the work earlier. Any thoughts or comments?
Very. And, you know, just the way of working is includes a lot of listening. It includes openness to ideas. You know, not feeling a need to control at all moments. And I'm not saying that states always behave that way by any means, but sometimes the sense of responsibility for statewide decision making can kind of constrain their how easy it may be for them to kind of step back a little and listen and let wisdom emerge. Plus, wisdom doesn't emerge immediately. You do have to keep at it for a period of time, and you know, just get past a certain amount of initial venting that may be needed and ultimately healthy in the long run. So those are some thoughts. I think I had a chance to talk about this with Paul Manna, who's a scholar of state policy in education, and has been curious about the ELLC, and in fact is writing about it. And you know, he says states work in networks a lot, and this one has some different and really productive, interesting features. And those are some of them.
Great. Thanks, Brenda. And definitely it's hard work for sure. All relationships require work, and more work, right? So it's a never-ending condition, but certainly a worthwhile one in the long run. Other questions, comments, or thoughts for our stakeholders? Carissa, I know you got to jump off in a minute, so I'm just wondering if there's anything from the audience that you'd like to ask of Carissa and CCSSO that we might do so now before she jumps off.
Paul, a question came in rather than my putting it in the chat to you to save time. A really good question came in from Kimberly from Oregon about any advice about high leverage strategies or approaches for navigating the socio-political context that emerged from the teams. In particular, the question seemed to be sparked from Brenda's comment about a board member being included on one of the teams. So the question is about navigating the socio-political context. We thought we would end with an easy one for Carissa.
Oh, you're going to ask me to do that one. Well, look, I don't have a clear, it's going to be different in every context, but what we do know is that when you involve people, when you talk to people, when you listen to people, they feel more inclined to be a part of what's happening. I think some of what we've seen over time is as new folks get elected or new folks be brought into roles, that they're like, you know, what's this thing? And so having an on-ramp for as new people come in, just like you did with this group, can be a way to do that. You're always going to have folks who have struggles with something that you might be able to do. But I think, you know, thinking about it in that way is probably the best advice that I have. Also going to people where they are, you know, the question you asked before about how do we sustain this? I think it's shared ownership. The more people who are bought into this and it's their thing rather than one single person, you know, like in our case, the chief who has to talk about the vision, it's not going to sustain itself. It'll leave when that person leaves. And so it has to be an approach that everyone feels a part of. And so I would just try to find a way through that.
Great. Thanks, Carissa.
Yep.
Brenda,
Thank
last
you.
question for you before we break to the breakout sessions. A question in the chat about why Wallace might have decided to have documentation from PSA from the very beginning, and how unique is that as an aspect of this work?
Well, we have been thrilled that they made that choice. We do think we've learned a lot. We do hope that our report it makes at least a start on communicating what we've learned about the uniqueness and about how it developed over time. And we try to convey some sense of that through our work. We also, we did a little bit of, perhaps contributed a little bit to the sort of cross-pollination across teams, because our team met regularly and we shared what we were seeing and hearing from the teams, and we were able to relay that back a little bit across, especially when everything became virtual. But it's been a treat.
Great, great. Well, listen, I just want to honor our time and recognize that the plenary portion of our section is coming to a close. And so as we transition, I want to thank Hal and our other steering committee members, along with Brenda, for your participation today. A rich reflection and some specific lessons learned, things that I think would be helpful for all of us going forward. As we transition to the facilitated state team meetings, just want to remind you not to log off, that you will be automatically directed to transition you to a breakout room. Another reminder that our final ELLC PLC will be a virtual convening in December, that date to be determined rather shortly, forthcoming. We will not reconvene in a plenary following the closing of the breakout sessions. So we will, as you end the breakout session, that will conclude today's convening. And for those of you who are not state ELLC team members, we thank you for joining us today. And with that, let's open our breakout rooms now. Thank you.